Sometimes the smallest details hold the greatest power. A simple patch on a uniform can carry more weight than medals, more meaning than rank, and more respect than years of service. What happens when someone who doesn't understand this power decides to mock it? What happens when the wrong person sees that mockery? This is the story of Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a quiet logistics coordinator whose unassuming appearance hid a legacy that would shake an entire military base to its core. It's about the moment when respect collided with ignorance, when assumptions crumbled, and when a single patch changed everything for everyone involved. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Sergeant Maria Rodriguez made her way to the logistics building. At 34, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her dark hair pulled back in regulation style, her uniform pressed and proper. To most who passed her in the hallway, she appeared unremarkable. Average height, average build, with the kind of face that blended into crowds. She preferred it that way. Maria had been stationed at Camp Pendleton for 18 months, working in supply chain management. Her days were filled with inventory reports, shipping manifests, and coordination calls with vendors. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. Every bullet, every MRE, every piece of equipment that kept Marines operational passed through her department's careful tracking system. The logistics building buzzed with its usual morning activity. Computer keyboards clicked, phones rang, and conversations about delivery schedules filled the air. Maria settled at her desk in the corner of the main floor, a position that gave her a clear view of the entire operation while keeping her somewhat apart from the daily office politics. "Morning, Rodriguez," called out Staff Sergeant Jennifer Kim from across the room. Kim was one of the few people who had made an effort to get to know Maria beyond work assignments. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Maria nodded her thanks, focusing on the stack of requisition forms that had accumulated over the weekend. The 2nd Battalion needed new communication equipment, the motor pool was requesting tire replacements, and 3 different units were asking about delayed ammunition deliveries. It would be another busy day. Around 10 o'clock, the building's atmosphere shifted. A group of Marines from the infantry training unit entered, their presence immediately commanding attention. They moved with the swagger that came from knowing they were the tip of the spear, the ones who would face enemy fire while others worked behind desks. Leading the group was Corporal Jake Mitchell, a 23-year-old from Texas who had completed 2 deployments in Afghanistan. Mitchell was everything the recruiting posters promised. Tall, muscular, with the kind of confident bearing that attracted both admiration and envy. His uniform displayed his combat action ribbon, his Afghanistan campaign medal, and several other decorations that marked him as someone who had seen real action. "All right, listen up," Mitchell announced to the logistics staff, his voice carrying across the room. "We need to expedite our equipment request from last week. Training exercise got moved up, and we can't wait around for you desk jockeys to figure out your filing system." Several logistics personnel bristled at the comment, but nobody spoke up. The tension between combat Marines and support staff was nothing new, though it usually remained unspoken. Mitchell seemed determined to make it explicit. Maria looked up from her paperwork, assessing the situation. She had dealt with impatient infantry Marines before. The key was to remain professional, get them what they needed efficiently, and avoid escalating any conflicts. She pulled up the relevant files on her computer and began cross-referencing the request with available inventory. "I can have your equipment ready for pickup by 1400 hours, Maria said calmly, not looking up from her screen. "Everything except the night vision scopes. Those are on back order from the manufacturer." Mitchell turned toward her voice, his eyes scanning until they found her at her corner desk. His gaze moved from her face down to a uniform, looking for rank insignia and unit patches. What he saw there made him smirk. "Well, well," Mitchell said, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real war hero over here, boys." The other Marines with him shifted uncomfortably. They had come in to handle a logistics issue, not to start trouble with support staff. But Mitchell was their senior, and challenging him publicly would have consequences. Maria's jaw tightened slightly, but she continued working on her computer. She had heard variations of this conversation before, though usually not so directly. The patch on her uniform often drew attention, sometimes curiosity, sometimes skepticism, and occasionally outright mockery from those who didn't understand its significance. "I'm sorry, was there something else you needed for your equipment request?" Maria asked, maintaining her professional tone. Mitchell took a step closer to her desk, his boots clicking on the polished floor. "Oh, I think we all need to appreciate what we're looking at here. This little supply clerk is wearing a patch I've never seen before. Looks pretty fancy, though." He turned to address the room. "Anyone else want to take a guess at what kind of super-secret mission our paper pusher here went on?" The room had gone quiet. Other logistics personnel pretended to focus on their work, but everyone was listening. Staff Sergeant Kim looked up from her desk with a warning expression. hoping Mitchell would drop whatever game he was playing. The patch in question was small, roughly 2 inches square, positioned just below Maria's name tape. It featured a distinctive design, a stylized mountain peak with crossed rifles, surrounded by a border that incorporated elements of both American and foreign military symbols. The colors were muted, earth tones that spoke of desert operations and covert missions. Mitchell leaned over Maria's desk, making a show of examining the patch more closely. This thing looks like something you'd buy at a surplus store. What is this supposed to be? Special forces? Rangers? Or maybe... He paused dramatically. Maybe it's from one of those weekend warrior fantasy camps where civilians pretend to be soldiers. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from some of the Marines, though others remained silent. Maria's hands paused over her keyboard. She took a slow breath, centering herself the way she had been trained years ago, in situations far more dangerous than this office confrontation. The patch represents my previous unit assignment, Maria said quietly. Now, about your equipment request. Previous unit assignment, Mitchell repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Right, and what unit would that be? The Office Supply Battalion? The Filing Cabinet Regiment? He was playing to his audience now, enjoying the attention and the discomfort he was causing. Maria saved her work and turned to face Mitchell directly. Her dark eyes met his with steady calm. I served with Joint Special Operations Command for 6 years before transferring to logistics. The patch commemorates that service. The room went completely silent. JSOC was not something anyone joked about. Joint Special Operations Command oversaw the military's most elite units. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the 75th Ranger Regiment's most classified operations, and other units whose existence was barely acknowledged. It was the organization that handled the missions nobody talked about, in places that didn't officially exist. Mitchell's smirk faltered for a moment, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. JSOC. Right. And I suppose you were leading raids in Afghanistan while looking like a soccer mum. The insult was crude and personal, designed to humiliate. Several people in the room winced. Mitchell had crossed a line that even the military's rough culture didn't usually tolerate. Personal attacks based on appearance, especially targeting women, were against regulations and basic decency. Maria stood up slowly from her chair. She was exactly 5'6" inches tall, but something in her bearing made her seem larger. Her posture had changed subtly. Straighter, more balanced, with the kind of readiness that suggested she could move very quickly if necessary. Corporal Mitchell, she said, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge. I've processed your equipment request. Your items will be ready for pickup at 1400 hours as I stated. If there's nothing else you need from the logistics department, I suggest you return to your unit. Mitchell felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. Other Marines were no longer looking at him with amusement. Some were studying Maria with new interest, while others seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. But Mitchell had committed himself to this course of action, and backing down would mean losing face in front of junior Marines. You know what I think? Mitchell said, his voice getting louder. I think someone in this Marine Corps has been handing out participation trophies. I think we've got people running around pretending they're operators when they've never been closer to combat than a computer screen. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. In military culture, stolen valor, claiming credit for service or achievements you hadn't earned, was among the most serious accusations one service member could make against another. Mitchell had essentially called Maria a fraud in front of witnesses. Maria nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. I see. She reached for her desk phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. The conversation that followed was brief and professional. This is Sergeant Rodriguez in logistics. I need to speak with Colonel Hayes immediately. Yes, it's urgent, thank you. She hung up and turned back to Mitchell. Colonel Hayes will see us in his office in 10 minutes. Since you've raised questions about the legitimacy of my service record, I think it's appropriate that we discuss this matter with our commanding officer. Mitchell's confidence wavered. He had expected Maria to either back down or respond with anger. He hadn't expected her to escalate the situation to their commanding officer. In the military hierarchy, involving a colonel in what should have been a minor interpersonal conflict was a serious step. Look, Mitchell started. You were just questioning my integrity and the legitimacy of my service, Maria interrupted, in front of witnesses. That's a serious accusation that deserves a serious response. Staff Sergeant Kim had been watching the exchange with growing alarm. She had known Maria for over a year and had always wondered about her background. Maria never talked about her previous assignments, never joined the usual conversations about deployment experiences, and had a way of deflecting questions about her military history. Kim had assumed Maria was simply private about her past, but now she was beginning to suspect there was much more to the story. The 10 minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. Mitchell's fellow Marines had distanced themselves from him, suddenly finding urgent tasks that required their attention elsewhere in the building. The logistics staff pretended to work while stealing glances at Maria and Mitchell. When the time came, Maria and Mitchell walked together to Colonel Hayes' office, their footsteps echoing in the corridor. Mitchell tried to break the tension with casual conversation, but Maria remained silent, her expression unreadable. Colonel Hayes was a career Marine with 30 years of service. He had commanded units in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified operations that would never appear in official records. His office walls displayed the kind of awards and commendations that came from leading Marines through some of the military's most challenging missions. "Have a seat," Hayes said as they entered his office. His tone was neutral, but his eyes were sharp as they assessed both Marines. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you said this was urgent." Maria remained standing at attention. "Sir, Corporal Mitchell has publicly questioned the legitimacy of my service record and accused me of wearing unauthorized insignia. Specifically, he has suggested that my JSOC patch is fraudulent and that I have never served in combat operations." Hayes looked at Mitchell, who was beginning to realize the serious trouble he might be in. "Corporal, is this accurate?" Mitchell straightened, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. "Sir, I may have questioned whether the sergeant's patch was appropriate for someone working in logistics. I've never seen that particular insignia before, and you decided to publicly humiliate a fellow Marine based on your unfamiliarity with her service record?" Hayes interrupted. "Sir, Charo 1. Hayes held up a hand for silence. He turned to his computer and began typing. Military service records were classified information, but commanding officers had access to summary data for personnel under their command. What Hayes saw on his screen made his eyebrows rise. He scrolled through several pages, his expression growing more serious with each line he read. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair and studied Maria with new understanding. "Sergeant Rodriguez, how long did you serve with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta?" The question hit the room like a physical force. Delta Force was the Army's most elite counter-terrorism unit, so secretive that the government rarely acknowledged its existence. For a Marine to have served with Delta meant she had been among the absolute best of the best, selected for missions that required skills and clearances far beyond normal military operations. 4 years, sir, Maria replied simply. Hayes continued reading from her file. "And before that, you completed Marine Force reconnaissance training and served 2 deployments with Marine Special Operations Command." "Yes, sir." "Your record shows deployment to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and several other locations that I'm not at liberty to discuss in present company." Hayes' tone had shifted from professional to respectful. "You've been awarded the Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, and several other commendations." Mitchell felt the floor dropping away beneath him. The Silver Star was the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat. The Bronze Star with V device was awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in combat operations. These weren't the kind of awards given to desk jockeys or people who had never seen real action. "The patch you're wearing," Hayes continued, "represents the Joint Special Operations Command Counterterrorism Task Force. It's authorized for personnel who have served with distinction in classified operations under JSOC command. Based on your record, you're not only authorized to wear it, you've earned the right through service that most Marines will never experience." Maria remained at attention, her expression unchanged. She had known this moment would come eventually. It always did. Someone would always challenge her credentials, question her background, or assume that her quiet demeanor meant she lacked combat experience. Hayes turned his attention to Mitchell, and his tone became significantly less friendly. "Corporal, you have publicly accused a decorated combat veteran of stolen valor. You have done so based on nothing more than your own ignorance and apparent assumption that women cannot serve in special operations roles. This represents a serious failure in judgment and military bearing." Mitchell's face had gone pale. Stolen valor accusations were taken extremely seriously in the military. Making false accusations could result in disciplinary action, while the public humiliation he had inflicted on Maria violated several regulations regarding treatment of fellow service members. "Sir, I had no way of knowing," Mitchell began. "You had no way of knowing because you didn't ask," Hayes cut him off. "Instead of inquiring about the sergeant's background respectfully, you chose to mock and humiliate her in front of other Marines. That kind of behavior is unbecoming of a Marine and specifically violates our standards regarding respect for fellow service members." The office fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Maria continued to stand at attention while Mitchell seemed to shrink into his chair. Hayes closed the file on his computer and stood up. Corporal Mitchell, you will report to First Sergeant Morrison immediately. You will explain your conduct today and accept whatever corrective action he deems appropriate. Additionally, you will prepare a formal written apology to Sergeant Rodriguez, which will be delivered in front of the same Marines who witnessed your inappropriate behavior. Mitchell nodded miserably. Yes, sir. Furthermore, Hayes continued, you will spend the next month working additional duties with the logistics department. Perhaps learning more about the complexity of supply operations will give you greater appreciation for the Marines who ensure your unit has the equipment it needs to function. It was a masterful punishment. Mitchell would not only have to apologize publicly, but he would spend the next month working under the supervision of the Marine he had humiliated. The irony would not be lost on anyone who heard about the incident. Hayes turned back to Maria. Sergeant Rodriguez, I apologize for the disrespectful treatment you received from a Marine under my command. Your service record speaks for itself, and you have conducted yourself with admirable professionalism throughout this incident. Thank you, sir, Maria replied. As they prepared to leave the colonel's office, Hayes made one final comment. Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm curious why you transferred from special operations to logistics. Your record suggests you could have continued advancing in the special operations community. Maria paused for a moment, considering her response. Sir, I served my country in the capacity it needed me most for several years. Now I'm serving in a different capacity that's equally important. Every mission requires logistic support. I wanted to contribute to that mission. It was a diplomatic answer that revealed nothing about her personal motivations while emphasizing her continued commitment to military service. Hayes nodded, recognizing both the professionalism of her response and the privacy she was maintaining about her personal decisions. As they left the colonel's office, Mitchell and Maria walked back toward the logistics building in silence. Mitchell's mind was racing with the implications of what had just happened. He had not only humiliated himself publicly, but he had also learned that his assumptions about military service and the people who performed different roles were completely wrong. When they reached the logistics building, the atmosphere was electric with tension and curiosity. Word of their visit to Colonel Hayes had spread, and everyone was eager to learn what had happened. Maria returned to her desk and resumed her work on the equipment request as if nothing had occurred. Mitchell stood awkwardly in the center of the room, aware that all eyes were on him. Staff Sergeant Kim approached him with a carefully neutral expression. Everything okay, Corporal? She asked. Mitchell looked around the room, then at Maria, who was focused on her computer screen. Actually, no. Everything is not okay. I owe some people an apology, starting with Sergeant Rodriguez. The day was far from over, and Mitchell was beginning to understand that the consequences of his actions would extend far beyond this single incident. His assumptions about Maria, about logistics personnel, and about what constituted real military service had been shattered in the span of an hour. As Maria continued her work processing the very equipment request that had brought Mitchell to her attention, she reflected on the familiar pattern she had experienced so many times before. People saw what they expected to see: a quiet woman working in an office job, someone who seemed unremarkable and safe to dismiss or mock. They rarely saw the scars hidden beneath her uniform sleeves, earned in places whose names were classified. They didn't see the nightmares that occasionally disrupted her sleep, or the way she automatically scanned every room for exits and potential threats. They didn't know about the lives she had saved, the missions she had completed, or the reason she had eventually chosen to step away from the world of special operations. But today, like so many times before, the truth had emerged. And once again, Maria Rodriguez had proven that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people we think we understand. The news of Mitchell's encounter with Maria Rodriguez spread through Camp Pendleton like wildfire. By evening chow, Marines throughout the base were discussing the logistics sergeant who had turned out to be a decorated special operations veteran. The story grew with each telling, as military stories often do, but the core facts remained consistent. An infantry Marine had publicly mocked a woman's service patch, only to discover she had more combat experience than most of the base combined. Maria spent the remainder of that first day fielding curious glances and carefully respectful questions from colleagues who were seeing her in an entirely new light. Staff Sergeant Kim lingered after work hours, clearly wanting to ask questions but unsure how to approach the subject. You never said anything, Kim finally ventured as Maria packed up her desk. There was nothing to say, Maria replied, shouldering her bag. My previous assignment ended. This one began. The work here is important too. Kim nodded, but her expression suggested she found Maria's explanation incomplete. The way you handled Mitchell, that took serious self-control. Most people would have lost their temper. Maria paused at the building entrance, considering her response. In my previous work, losing control could get people killed. It becomes a habit. That evening, Maria drove home to a small apartment off base, a modest one-bedroom place that reflected her practical approach to life. The furnishings were simple but comfortable: a couch, a television, bookshelves filled with both military history and contemporary fiction. The only decorations that hinted at her military background were a few photographs on the mantel showing her with various units, though the locations and specific operations remained deliberately ambiguous. She had chosen to live off base specifically to maintain separation between her work life and personal time. Too many Marines lived and breathed the military 24 hours a day, and Maria had learned the importance of having space to decompress and remember who she was beyond her uniform and rank. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the logistics office. General Patricia Morrison, the base commanding general, made an unscheduled appearance that sent the entire building into a flurry of activity. Two-star generals didn't typically visit logistics departments without significant cause. General Morrison was a groundbreaking figure in Marine Corps history. She had been among the first women to serve in combat roles when the military opened previously restricted positions, and she had risen through the ranks during an era when female Marines faced constant scrutiny and skepticism about their capabilities. Her reputation was built on tactical brilliance, unwavering standards, and zero tolerance for discrimination or unprofessional behavior. "Where is Sergeant Rodriguez?" the general asked as she entered the main office area. Maria stood immediately from her desk. "Here, ma'am." General Morrison approached, her aide and security detail maintaining respectful distance. Up close, she was smaller than her commanding presence suggested, but her eyes held the kind of intensity that came from years of making life-and-death decisions. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'd like to speak with you privately," the general said. "Is there a conference room available?" Staff Sergeant Kim quickly arranged for them to use the building's small conference room, then ensured they would not be disturbed. As the door closed, Maria found herself alone with one of the most senior Marines on the base. "At ease, Sergeant," General Morrison said, taking a seat across the conference table. "I've been reading your service record, and I wanted to meet you personally." Maria relaxed slightly but remained alert. Generals didn't typically seek out individual sergeants for casual conversations. "Your record is quite remarkable," the general continued. "Force Reconnaissance, Marine Special Operations Command, and then 4 years with Delta Force. That's a career path most Marines only dream about." "Thank you, ma'am." General Morrison leaned forward slightly. "I'm particularly interested in your time with the Joint Special Operations Command Counterterrorism Task Force. I've read the sanitized version of your service record, but I have enough clearance to understand that you were involved in some extremely high-risk operations." Maria nodded but didn't elaborate. Even with the general's clearance level, certain operational details would remain classified indefinitely. The Silver Star citation in your file mentions extraordinary heroism during combat operations against enemy forces. That's not language we use lightly. The general paused. "What I find most impressive is that you earned these commendations while serving in units that were almost entirely male. That couldn't have been easy?" "The work was what mattered, ma'am," Maria replied. "Gender became irrelevant when lives were at stake." General Morrison smiled. Spoken like a true professional. "But I suspect it was more complicated than that." She pulled out a folder and opened it on the table. "I've also been briefed on yesterday's incident with Corporal Mitchell." Maria's expression remained neutral, but she tensed slightly. "Let me be clear," the general continued. "Mitchell's behavior was completely unacceptable. But what interests me more is how you handled the situation. You could have responded with anger, you could have pulled rank based on your experience, or you could have simply ignored him. Instead, you chose to escalate through proper channels and let the facts speak for themselves." "It seemed like the most professional approach, ma'am." "It was masterful," General Morrison said. "You turned what could have been a destructive confrontation into a teaching moment. Mitchell learned something important about making assumptions, your colleagues gained respect for logistics personnel, and you maintained your dignity throughout the entire process." The general closed the folder and leaned back. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I want to discuss your future with the Marine Corps. Your current assignment expires in 8 months. Have you considered what comes next?" Maria had been dreading this conversation. She had hoped to complete her current assignment quietly and then make decisions about her future without attracting high-level attention. "I've been considering my options, ma'am." "Let me present some options you might not have considered," the general said. "I'm establishing a new program to integrate special operations veterans into leadership roles throughout the Marine Corps. The goal is to bring the tactical expertise and problem-solving abilities developed in special operations to traditional Marine units." She pulled out another document. "Specifically, I'd like you to consider Officer Candidate School. With your experience and leadership capabilities, you could be commissioned as a second lieutenant and fast-tracked for command positions." The offer caught Maria completely off guard. She had always been enlisted personnel, and the transition to officer status would represent a fundamental change in her military career. "Ma'am, I'm honored by the offer, but before you decline," the general interrupted, "let me explain why this matters. The Marine Corps is changing. We're fighting different kinds of wars, facing different kinds of threats, and we need leaders who understand both conventional and unconventional warfare. Your background makes you uniquely qualified to help bridge that gap." Maria considered the implications. Becoming an officer would mean more responsibility, more visibility, and less of the anonymity she had come to value. It would also mean committing to several more years of military service when she had been considering leaving altogether. "There's another factor to consider," the general added. "Yesterday's incident with Mitchell isn't unique. Throughout the Marine Corps, we have personnel who don't understand or respect the contributions of different communities within our organization. We need leaders who can build bridges, educate through example, and ensure that all Marines are treated with the respect they've earned." The conversation continued for another hour, during which General Morrison outlined various career paths and opportunities. When they finally concluded, Maria had agreed to consider the officer program, but hadn't committed to anything specific. As the general prepared to leave, she made one final observation. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you've earned the right to make whatever choices you feel are best for your future, but I hope you'll consider the impact you could have on the next generation of Marines. Your example, both in combat and in how you conduct yourself, could influence countless young service members." After the general left, Maria returned to her desk to find the logistics office buzzing with curiosity about the high-level visit. She deflected questions politely but firmly, focusing on the backlog of work that had accumulated during her absence. Later that afternoon, Corporal Mitchell appeared at the logistics building to begin his month of additional duties. The public apology had been delivered that morning in front of the same Marines who had witnessed his inappropriate behavior. According to witnesses, Mitchell had been genuinely contrite, acknowledging both his disrespectful conduct and his ignorance about Maria's background. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Mitchell said as he approached her desk, "First Sergeant Morrison sent me over. I'm supposed to report to you for duty assignment." Maria looked up from her computer. Mitchell appeared genuinely humbled by the previous day's events. The swagger and arrogance were gone, replaced by nervous respect. "You'll be working with Staff Sergeant Kim on inventory management," Maria said. "She'll explain the procedures and assign your specific tasks." Mitchell nodded. "Sergeant, I want you to know that I meant what I said in my apology this morning. I was completely out of line and I'm sorry." Maria studied his expression, evaluating his sincerity. "Apology accepted, Corporal. Let's focus on the work." Over the following days, Mitchell's presence in the logistics office created an interesting dynamic. His fellow Marines initially treated his assignment as punishment duty, but as he began to understand the complexity of supply chain management, his attitude shifted. He discovered that ensuring proper equipment distribution required detailed knowledge, careful planning, and constant coordination with multiple units and vendors. "I had no idea how complicated this stuff was," Mitchell admitted to Kim during his second week. "We just put in requests and expect our gear to show up. I never thought about everything that happens in between." Kim, who had initially been skeptical about Mitchell's attitude, began to see genuine change in his perspective. "Most combat Marines don't think about logistics until something goes wrong," she replied. "Then it becomes the most important thing in the world." Mitchell also began observing Maria more carefully, trying to understand how someone with her background had transitioned so seamlessly into logistics work. He noticed the way she analyzed problems systematically, her ability to prioritize competing demands, and her skill at managing relationships with demanding customers, qualities that would have been essential in special operations. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Mitchell said one afternoon as they worked together on a particularly complex equipment request, "can I ask you something?" Over the past 2 weeks, Mitchell had proven himself to be a conscientious worker and had avoided any further inappropriate behavior. "Why did you leave special operations?" he asked. "I mean, you could have stayed, right? Continued advancing in that world?" It was the question Maria had been expecting. She had seen the curiosity in Mitchell's eyes, the same curiosity she encountered wherever her background became known. "Special operations takes a toll," she said carefully. "Physical, mental, emotional. After several years, I wanted to contribute in a different way." Mitchell nodded, but his expression suggested he found the answer incomplete. "Was it because of being a woman in those units? I've heard it can be pretty rough." Maria paused her work and looked at Mitchell directly. "Every challenge I faced made me stronger, but eventually, I realized that my skills and experience could benefit the Marine Corps in different ways. Logistics affects every Marine on every mission." I wanted to be part of that broader impact. It was more personal information than Maria typically shared, but she sensed that Mitchell was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply satisfy curiosity. I respect that, Mitchell said, and I'm sorry I didn't understand it before. The conversation marked a turning point in their working relationship. Mitchell began asking thoughtful questions about logistics procedures, and Maria found herself explaining not just the mechanics of supply chain management, but the strategic thinking behind various decisions. Meanwhile, word of General Morrison's visit and her interest in Maria had spread throughout the command structure. Several senior officers made casual visits to the logistics office, ostensibly to check on operations, but clearly curious about the sergeant who had attracted such high-level attention. Colonel Hayes stopped by one morning, spending time reviewing operations and asking detailed questions about efficiency improvements and cost management. His visit wasn't unusual. Commanders regularly checked on various departments, but the timing and focus suggested he was evaluating Maria's performance and potential. Your suggestions for streamlining the requisition process are impressive, Hayes told Maria as he prepared to leave. Have you given thought to pursuing advanced education? The Marine Corps has programs that could help you develop these ideas further. It was another hint about career advancement opportunities, delivered with the subtle pressure that marked military mentorship. Maria appreciated the support but felt increasingly uncomfortable with the attention her background was generating. That evening, Maria sat in her apartment considering the various pressures and opportunities that were emerging. The incident with Mitchell had inadvertently exposed her background and attracted attention she had hoped to avoid. General Morrison's offer represented a significant career opportunity, but would require commitments she wasn't sure she wanted to make. She pulled out a photograph from her desk drawer, one of the few mementos she had kept from her special operations days. It showed her with her Delta Force team after a successful mission, their faces tired but satisfied. 3 of the 5 Marines in the photograph had been killed in subsequent operations, a reminder of why she had eventually chosen to leave that world behind. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her sister's number from California. Hey Maria, how are things going? Complicated, Maria replied. Work stuff. Her sister Elena was one of the few people who knew the full extent of Maria's military background. As a civilian with no military experience, Elena often provided perspective that helped Maria navigate the complex decisions that military life required. Want to talk about it? Elena asked. Maria found herself explaining the previous week's events, from Mitchell's inappropriate behavior to General Morrison's unexpected offer. Elena listened without interrupting, a skill she had developed over years of hearing about Maria's military experiences. So the question is whether you want to stay in the Marines and become an officer, or finish your current assignment and get out, Elena summarized. That's part of it, Maria said, but it's also about whether I want the kind of visibility that comes with leadership positions. I chose logistics specifically because it would let me contribute without being in the spotlight. Elena was quiet for a moment. You know, you've spent your entire adult life serving other people. Maybe it's time to think about what you actually want for yourself. It was a simple observation, but it cut to the heart of Maria's dilemma. For years, her decisions had been guided by duty, mission requirements, and the needs of the Marine Corps. The idea of making choices based on personal desires felt almost foreign. The conversation with Elena continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from career decisions to family relationships to Maria's long-term goals beyond the military. When they finally hung up, Maria felt clear about the questions she needed to answer, even if she wasn't yet ready to make final decisions. The next morning brought news that would complicate Maria's situation even further. Staff Sergeant Kim approached her desk with an expression that mixed excitement and concern. Maria, you need to see this, Kim said, handing her a copy of the base newspaper, the Pendleton Pioneer. The headline read, Decorated Special Operations Veteran Brings Expertise to Base Logistics. The article, while respectful and factually accurate, detailed Maria's military background and the recent incident with Mitchell. It portrayed her as an example of the diverse talents and experiences found throughout the Marine Corps, emphasizing how special operations skills could enhance traditional military roles. Maria read the article with growing dismay. While the coverage was positive, it represented exactly the kind of public attention she had hoped to avoid. The article would be read by thousands of Marines on base and would likely be picked up by other military publications. How did they get this information? Maria asked. Kim looked uncomfortable. The reporter interviewed several people who were in the building when Mitchell made his comments. Plus, Colonel Hayes apparently spoke with him about the importance of recognizing diverse contributions within the Marine Corps. It was clear that Maria's story had become something larger than a simple workplace conflict. It had evolved into a symbol of hidden talent within the military, the importance of respecting all service members, and the value of diverse experiences in military leadership. As Maria read through the article again, she realized that her period of anonymity was definitively over. The choices she made about her future would now be watched and discussed by people throughout the base and beyond. The quiet logistics sergeant who had preferred to work in the background had become a public figure whether she wanted it or not. The weight of that realization would influence every decision she made in the weeks and months ahead. The publication of the newspaper article transformed Maria Rodriguez from an anonymous logistics sergeant into one of the most discussed Marines at Camp Pendleton. Within days, her story had spread beyond the base, appearing in military publications and social media platforms where veterans shared their own experiences with hidden talents and unrecognized service members. Maria arrived at work on Monday morning to find her email inbox flooded with messages from Marines across the country. Some shared their own stories of transitioning from combat roles to support positions, others asked for career advice, and many simply expressed admiration for her service and the professional way she had handled Mitchell's inappropriate behavior. "This is getting out of hand," Maria told Staff Sergeant Kim as she scrolled through dozens of unread messages. "I just wanted to do my job." Kim, who had been fielding phone calls from reporters and military researchers all morning, sympathized with Maria's frustration. "The story has taken on a life of its own. Apparently, you've become a symbol of something bigger than what happened here." The broader attention was both flattering and overwhelming. Maria had chosen her current assignment specifically to avoid the scrutiny that came with high-profile military roles. Now she found herself receiving more attention than she had ever experienced, even during her most classified special operations missions. The situation became more complex when Colonel Hayes called Maria into his office later that week. She expected a routine discussion about the media attention, but Hayes had more significant news to share. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I've received a call from the Pentagon," Hayes began. "The Commandant of the Marine Corps has asked to meet with you." The Commandant was the highest-ranking Marine, responsible for leading the entire service. Such meetings were typically reserved for the most senior officers or Marines who had performed extraordinary acts of heroism. "Sir, may I ask why?" Hayes consulted his notes. "Apparently, your story has reached senior leadership as an example of the kind of talent retention and career flexibility the Marine Corps needs to develop. They're interested in discussing your experiences and getting your perspective on how the service can better utilize Marines with diverse backgrounds." The meeting was scheduled for the following month in Washington, D.C. Maria would fly to the Pentagon, spend a day briefing senior leadership, and participate in discussions about military career development and talent management. "Sir, I need to be honest," Maria said. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable being used as a poster child for military career flexibility. My situation is fairly unique, and I don't know how much it can be generalized to other Marines." Hayes nodded. "I understand your concerns, but you should also consider the impact your example could have on military policy. The Marine Corps is struggling with retention of experienced personnel, particularly women and Marines with specialized skills. Your story demonstrates that there are ways to keep valuable people in service, even when they want to transition to different roles." Over the following weeks, Maria found herself caught between competing pressures. General Morrison continued to advocate for her to pursue officer training, emphasizing the leadership opportunities and potential impact she could have on Marine Corps culture. Colonel Hayes supported the Pentagon meetings but also hinted that her current assignment could be extended if she preferred to remain in logistics. Meanwhile, Corporal Mitchell had become an unexpected ally, using his own experience to advocate for better understanding between combat and support personnel. Mitchell's transformation had been remarkable to witness. His month of additional duty in logistics had evolved into genuine interest in supply chain management. He had requested permission to extend his time with the logistics unit, using his infantry background to help improve coordination between combat units and support personnel. "You know what I learned?" Mitchell said during one of their weekly planning meetings. "Combat Marines think logistics is just about moving boxes around, but it's actually about understanding exactly what each mission requires and making sure the right resources are available at exactly the right time and place." Maria appreciated Mitchell's growth, but she also recognized that his enthusiasm was partly motivated by guilt about his initial behavior. He had become one of her strongest supporters, frequently telling other Marines about the complexity and importance of logistics work. The attention wasn't limited to professional circles. Maria began receiving invitations to speak at veterans organizations, military spouse groups, and career development seminars. Each invitation represented an opportunity to influence military culture and policy, but also meant more time in the spotlight she had hoped to avoid. 3 weeks before her scheduled Pentagon meeting, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She requested a meeting with General Morrison to discuss her future plans. "General, I've given considerable thought to the officer program and the various opportunities you've presented," Maria began when they met in Morrison's office. "I'm grateful for your confidence in my abilities, but I've decided not to pursue a commission." General Morrison leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. "May I ask why?" Maria had rehearsed this conversation, but actually having it was more difficult than she had anticipated. "Ma'am, for the past 15 years, I've defined myself primarily through military service. First in combat roles, then in special operations, and now in logistics. Throughout that time, I've made decisions based on duty, mission requirements, and what the Marine Corps needed from me." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I've realized is that I've never really considered what I want for myself, independent of military service. The attention from this incident has made me think about who I am when I'm not wearing this uniform." General Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very honest and mature perspective, but it also suggests you're considering leaving the Marine Corps altogether." "I am," Maria replied. "When my current assignment ends, I plan to complete my service and transition to civilian life." The admission felt both liberating and terrifying. Maria had never seriously considered life outside the military, but recent events had forced her to examine her long-term goals and personal desires. "What would you do in civilian life?" the general asked. "I'm not entirely sure yet," Maria admitted, "but I've been thinking about using my logistics and operations experience in the private sector, maybe consulting for companies that need help with supply chain management or crisis response planning." General Morrison was quiet for several minutes considering Maria's decision. "I'm disappointed to lose you, but I respect your reasoning. The Marine Corps has benefited tremendously from your service, and we should support whatever path you choose next." She leaned forward. "However, I have one request. I'd like you to keep your Pentagon meeting scheduled, even if you're planning to leave military service. Your perspective on career transitions and talent retention could influence policies that help other Marines make similar choices." Maria agreed to honor the Pentagon commitment, viewing it as a final contribution to the organization that had shaped her adult life. The news of Maria's decision to leave military service sparked intense discussion throughout Camp Pendleton. Some Marines understood her choice, recognizing the personal toll that military life could take, especially for those who had served in high-stress combat roles. Others viewed her departure as a waste of talent and experience that the Marine Corps desperately needed. Mitchell was among those who struggled to understand Maria's decision. During one of their last working sessions together, he raised the subject directly. "Sergeant, can I ask you something personal?" Mitchell said as they reviewed equipment inventories. "Why are you leaving? You're obviously good at this. People respect you, and you could have a huge impact on the Marine Corps." Maria set down her papers and considered how to respond. Mitchell had earned the right to an honest answer through his own growth and changed perspective. "Mitchell, do you remember what you said when you first came to this office? About desk jockeys and people who don't see real action?" "Yeah, and I was completely wrong about that." "You weren't entirely wrong," Maria said. "You were wrong about me specifically, and wrong about logistics personnel in general. But you were right that there's a difference between different types of military service. What you didn't understand is that those differences don't make one type of service more valuable than another." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "I spent years in combat roles where success was measured in lives saved, missions completed, and enemies defeated. Those metrics were clear and immediate. Then I transitioned to logistics, where success is measured differently, by efficiency, cost management, and customer satisfaction." Mitchell nodded, following her reasoning. "Both types of service matter," Maria continued. "But for me personally, I've reached a point where I want to explore what I can contribute outside of military structure. I want to find out who I am when success isn't defined by military metrics." It was the most personal insight Maria had shared about her decision, and Mitchell seemed to understand the deeper implications. "Will you miss it?" he asked. "Parts of it," Maria replied honestly. "I'll miss the sense of purpose, the camaraderie, and the feeling that my work directly contributes to something larger than myself. But I won't miss the constraints, the hierarchy, or the constant pressure to define myself through my service record." Mitchell's month of additional duty had officially ended, but he had requested permission to continue working part-time with the logistics unit while maintaining his primary infantry assignments. His request had been approved, creating an informal liaison position between combat and support units. "You know," Mitchell said, "if you hadn't handled our first meeting the way you did, I might never have learned what I learned here. You could have embarrassed me or gotten me in serious trouble, but instead you turned it into a teaching moment. Maria smiled. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected situations. 3 days before Maria's Pentagon meeting, she received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. Staff Sergeant Kim had called ahead but hadn't explained the purpose of her visit. "I brought something for you," Kim said when Maria opened the door. She handed over a thick folder containing letters, emails, and printed social media posts. "What's this?" Maria asked. "Messages from Marines around the country who heard your story," Kim explained. "Some are thank you notes, some are people sharing their own experiences, and some are asking for advice about their own career decisions." Maria opened the folder and began reading. The messages were deeply personal, describing struggles with career transitions, challenges faced by women in military service, and gratitude for Maria's example of professionalism under pressure. One letter particularly caught her attention. It was from a female Marine corporal stationed in North Carolina who had been considering leaving military service after experiencing harassment from male colleagues. The corporal wrote that Maria's story had inspired her to file formal complaints and fight for the respectful treatment she deserved. Another message came from a Marine veteran who had transitioned to civilian logistics work after struggling with PTSD from combat deployments. He thanked Maria for demonstrating that transition from military to civilian roles could be successful and meaningful. "There are over 200 messages," Kim said. "Your story has resonated with a lot of people who are feeling isolated or uncertain about their own situations." As Maria read through the messages, she began to understand the broader impact of her experience. What had started as a simple workplace conflict had evolved into something that touched on fundamental issues of military culture, career development, and personal identity. "Kim, can I ask you something?" Maria said as they sat in her living room surrounded by the messages. "Do you think I'm making the right decision by leaving?" "I think you're making the right decision for you. But I also think you should know that your influence will continue long after you leave. The way you handled Mitchell, the example you've set, the conversations you've started, those things matter beyond your individual service." 2 days later, Maria flew to Washington for her Pentagon meeting. The session included the Commandant of the Marine Corps, several general officers, and senior enlisted leaders from across the service. The discussion covered topics ranging from career flexibility and talent retention to leadership development and military culture change. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the Commandant said during one portion of the meeting, "your story has generated significant discussion at the highest levels of Marine Corps leadership. What recommendations would you make for better utilizing Marines with diverse backgrounds and experience?" Maria had prepared for this question, drawing on her own experiences and the messages she had received from other Marines. "Sir, I think the Marine Corps needs to recognize that career paths don't always follow traditional patterns," she replied. "Marines who transition from combat to support roles aren't stepping down, they're applying their skills in different ways. Similarly, Marines who want to change career fields or take breaks from high-stress assignments aren't necessarily lacking commitment, they may be finding sustainable ways to continue serving." She continued, "The key is creating systems that allow for flexibility while maintaining standards and readiness. My transition from special operations to logistics worked because both roles valued problem-solving, attention to detail, and working under pressure. Other Marines might find similar connections between their combat experience and different military career fields." The discussion continued for several hours, covering policy recommendations, cultural changes, and specific programs that could improve career flexibility. Maria found herself drawing on not just her own experiences but the stories shared by the Marines who had written to her. When the meeting concluded, the Commandant thanked Maria personally for her service and insights. "Your perspective has been invaluable," he said. "We'll be implementing several of your recommendations, and we hope you'll consider remaining available as a consultant as we develop these programs." Maria agreed to provide advice and feedback as the Marine Corps developed new policies, even after her transition to civilian life. Flying back to California, Maria reflected on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken over the past 2 months. What had started as a routine day in the logistics office had evolved into national attention, policy discussions at the Pentagon, and hundreds of personal messages from fellow Marines. More importantly, the experience had forced her to examine her own motivations, goals, and identity beyond military service. For the first time in her adult life, she was making decisions based on personal desires rather than duty requirements. Upon returning to Camp Pendleton, Maria spent her final weeks completing projects, training her replacement, and transitioning responsibilities. The process was bittersweet, as she had genuinely enjoyed the work and the relationship she had built. Corporal Mitchell organized a farewell gathering for Maria, inviting Marines from both logistics and infantry units. The event reflected the bridge building that had occurred since their initial confrontation, with combat and support personnel mixing comfortably and discussing their interconnected roles. "I want to thank Sergeant Rodriguez," Mitchell said during the informal ceremony, "not just for her service to the Marine Corps, but for the lessons she taught me about respect, professionalism, and the danger of making assumptions about people." He paused, looking around the room. "I learned that every Marine has a story, every job contributes to the mission, and the most impressive people are often the ones who don't feel the need to talk about their accomplishments." Maria responded with brief remarks thanking her colleagues and emphasizing the importance of the logistics mission. She avoided dwelling on her special operations background, instead focusing on the meaningful work performed by the supply chain management team. General Morrison attended the farewell gathering, using the opportunity to present Maria with a commendation for her contributions to base operations and her role in improving relationships between different military communities. "Sergeant Rodriguez exemplifies the kind of leader the Marine Corps needs," the general said. "Her technical expertise, professionalism, and commitment to excellence have benefited every Marine on this base. While we're sorry to lose her, we're proud of the impact she's made and excited about her future endeavors." On her final day of active duty, Maria completed her out-processing paperwork and turned in her uniforms and equipment. The transition felt surreal after 15 years of military life, but also liberating in ways she was still discovering. Staff Sergeant Kim accompanied Maria to her final administrative appointments. "Any regrets?" Kim asked as they walked across the base one last time. Maria considered the question. "About leaving? No. About the way everything unfolded? Sometimes. I never wanted this much attention or to become a symbol of anything, but I'm proud of the conversations that started and the changes that might result." 6 months after leaving military service, Maria had established a successful consulting business specializing in supply chain management and organizational efficiency. Her first clients were defense contractors who valued her unique combination of military logistics experience and special operations problem-solving skills. She maintained contact with several Marines from Camp Pendleton, including Mitchell, who had been promoted to sergeant, and was developing innovative programs to improve coordination between combat and support units. The policies developed based on Maria's Pentagon recommendations had been implemented across the Marine Corps, creating more flexible career paths and better recognition for Marines who transitioned between different types of assignments. Most importantly, Maria had found the balance she had been seeking between professional fulfillment and personal identity. She was no longer defined solely by her military service record, but she continued to draw on the skills and experiences that military life had provided. The incident with Mitchell had taught both of them valuable lessons. For Mitchell, it had demonstrated the danger of assumptions and the importance of respecting all forms of service. For Maria, it had forced her to examine her own goals and make choices based on personal desires rather than external expectations. Years later, when military leadership programs studied cases of effective conflict resolution and career development, Maria's story became a standard example of how professional response to inappropriate behavior could create positive change for entire organizations. But for Maria herself, the most important outcome was simpler. She had learned to define success on her own terms, independent of military metrics or external validation. The quiet logistics sergeant who had preferred to work in the background had discovered that sometimes the most powerful impact comes not from seeking attention, but from maintaining integrity when attention is thrust upon you. The patch that had started the entire controversy, the small square of fabric representing her JSOC service, now sat in a frame in Maria's civilian office. It served not as a symbol of past glory, but as a reminder that every person carries experiences and capabilities that may not be immediately visible to others. The lesson applied far beyond military service. In corporate boardrooms, community organizations, and daily interactions, people regularly made assumptions about others based on limited information. Maria's story became a reminder that the most impressive qualifications are often worn quietly, and the most professional response to disrespect is to let facts speak louder than emotions. Corporal Mitchell had learned that lesson in a public and humbling way. The Marine who had mocked a logistics sergeant for wearing a patch he didn't recognize had discovered that his assumptions revealed more about his own limitations than about the person he was judging. The general who had seen it all unfold had witnessed something more valuable than any training exercise. A real-world example of how military culture could evolve when individuals chose professional growth over personal pride. In the end, the story of the Marine who mocked her patch became less about military service and more about human nature, the danger of assumptions, the power of dignity under pressure, and the possibility that our most important lessons come from the people we least expect to teach us. The Marine mocked her patch. Then the general saw it and halted everything.